I am the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I want to talk about Fichte's foundation for human knowledge. Aiming to ground all human knowledge on a proper foundation, Johann Gottlieb Fichte discovers it is all in the eye. Fichte is a classic case of how you cannot keep a good man down. The eldest son, born in 1762 to a poor family, his prodigious intellect brought him to the attention of a local baron who saw his potential and sponsored his education. The baron had missed the sermon at church. When he wanted to catch up, he was told to seek out young Fichte, who would be able to tell him what it was about. Fichte was able to repeat the sermon back to him ad verbatim. However, the baron died before Fichte could complete his university education, and hence Fichte had to go to work, which he did as a private tutor. One of his students wanted to learn about Immanuel Kant's writing, which Fichte was then unacquainted with. So Fichte went to learn about it, which was a turning point in his life. In his own words, it sparked a revolution in his thinking. He had the opportunity to meet Kant, though not much came out of it. Fichte later, however, wrote an essay entitled Attempt at a Critique of All Revelation, criticizing religious revelation. Kant read it and was impressed, and got it published by his own publishers in 1792, though it, for unknown reasons, came out anonymously, which would have been a disaster, but turned out to be a stroke of luck for Fichte. The readers of that essay thought it was Kant who wrote it, and when Kant told the world that the actual author was Fichte, it launched Fichte's career as a public intellectual. Several years later, Fichte was offered a teaching position at the University of Vienna in critical philosophy. Critical philosophy is what Kant's philosophy is known as, since the titles of three of his major works began with the word critique, the first being Critique of Pure Reason. Prior to this offer, Fichte had delivered a series of talks in 1794 to a group of friends and intellectuals in Zurich, where he aimed to ground Kant's critical philosophy. It was then that he received the offer at the University of Vienna. In anticipation, he wrote a pamphlet to inform prospective students what he was going to teach. The pamphlet is entitled Concerning the Concept of the Wissenschaftslehre. He prepared handout for his students, and so as he was delivering the lectures, he was also at the same time writing these notes, which later became foundation of the entire Wissenschaftslehre. He would go on to amplify and revise his ideas till his death in 1814, during the time of the Napoleonic Wars against France. So what was Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre about? What does that word even mean? Wissenschaft is science and Lehre is doctrine in German. So Wissenschaftslehre is the doctrine of science. However, one should understand Fichte's use of the word science when saying Wissenschaftslehre not as the physical sciences of physics, chemistry, and biology, but science as the project of knowledge itself. Fichte's grand project is to lay the foundations for all of human knowledge. In epistemological terms, where epistemology is the theory of knowledge, he is a foundationalist. There are several conceptions of how our knowledge is constituted. Foundationalism is the most common conception, where knowledge is built up from foundational principles, the way a building is built up on its foundations. This idea goes back to ancient times, where the pre-Socratic thinkers tried to conceive of a foundational principle to explain everything else by. For example, Thales, who came up with water, and Heraclitus with fire. Foundationalism has its theoretical problems. For instance, how does water go on to explain facts like, I went to the supermarket yesterday? Subsequently, later concepts emerged such as coherentism, where each belief is supported by a web of other beliefs. None of these beliefs are necessarily grounded in any particular belief, which is why Fichte criticizes coherentism as building a castle in the air. To properly understand what Fichte was doing, we need to understand his intellectual milieu. He lived at the tail end of what philosophy terms as the modern period. It may seem strange that the modern period for philosophy began in the 17th century. René Descartes launched the epoch, which marks a shift away from theology to scientific rationality. To understand what Fichte was trying to do, we need to understand what Descartes did with his act of radical doubt some 150 years earlier. Descartes too was trying to think of a foundational principle to ground all knowledge. His method is to doubt everything, to doubt even what his senses are telling him, since an evil demon may be tricking him into sensing what he sensed. After stripping away what cannot be known for sure, Descartes made the realization cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. This is the motto that launched the modern era of thought. Even as one doubts everything, there must be someone doing the doubting or thinking. For someone to be thinking, that someone must first of all exist. If you find this idea hard to wrap your head around, it is because it is an idea so simple, obvious even once you see it. If you do not see it, you must try, like Descartes, to lose all your preconceptions and already formed notions. I believe any reader of Fichte will tell you that his Wissenschaftslehre is hard going to read, and one reason is because he is saying something so basic that you may misunderstand him because you have not done what Descartes did to lose all your already existing conceptions. I will return to this later, but for now, another reason why Fichte is difficult to read is because prior to reading the Wissenschaftslehre, you need to also know at least a little about Kant's critical philosophy. Kant's life overlaps with Fichte. Kant was already middle-aged when Fichte was born. However, when Kant's most important work, Critique of Pure Reason, hit the press in 1781, Fichte would have been in his intellectual prime. As already mentioned, when Fichte encountered Kant's work, it was an intellectual revolution for him. In brief, Kant's major breakthrough in the Critique of Pure Reason is transcendental idealism. The big idea is that we can never encounter the world as it really is. When we encounter the world, we take in sensory data, which have to be processed by our faculty of understanding in order to make sense of it. The raw sensory data is processed through 12 categories, space and time. The 12 categories Kant came up with divide into 4 groups. Quantity comprises unity, plurality, and totality. Quality comprises reality, negation, and limitation. Relation comprises substance and accident, cause and effect, and reciprocity. And modality comprises possibility, existence, and necessity. Adding in time and space, that makes 14. This theory is transcendental because we need to go beyond or transcend our sense experience. It is ideal because how we understand the world is not the world in itself, but our representation of the world. Representations are the output after sense data has been processed by our minds. The word ideal here is not the sense of something perfect or wonderful, but ideal as in the realm of ideas, that is, mental or in the mind. While Kant must have thought deep and hard to come up with these categories, he did not provide a basis for them. The lack of proof for the categories is precisely the gap that Fichte is filling with his Wissenschaftslehre. Fichte sees himself as a heir of Kant's critical philosophy. He is convinced Kant is spot on with his theory, but sees the need for it to be grounded, to be definitively proven as opposed to just postulated. Hence it makes it his lifelong project to provide the grounding for Kant's transcendental idealism. As an epistemological foundationalist, Fichte believes that each specific science needs its own founding principles. And then there is the science of all sciences to ground all the specific sciences, which is philosophy of Wissenschaftslehre, the doctrine of all knowledge. This science of all sciences itself requires its own foundational principle. After what must have been long and hard contemplation, the first principle Fichte came up with is, I am. You have to realize that while this may seem somewhat simple, even obvious, its simplicity, purity, and even obviousness is precisely what makes it the foundational principle. He explains how he discovers this. The reason why he does not say that he will prove it is because what is most fundamental is not something which can be proven, since proving requires a reliance of propositions they are themselves certain on which to base the proof on. Given that what he wants to find out are indeed these propositions that are the basis from which other propositions can be proven, what he proposes to be the foundational principles are themselves already rock bottom. Nonetheless, he offers an explanation, beginning from what is self-evident. A is A or A equals to a fact of empirical consciousness, something we know to be certain. What this means is that a thing is a thing, identical to itself. Those who have studied logic will recognize this to be the principle of identity, but Fichte does not appeal to logic, because what he is trying to arrive at is meant to be prior to all other knowledge, including knowledge as fundamental as logic, similar to what Descartes was doing with his method of radical doubt. Instead, logic is something to be derived from the Wissenschaftslehre. What A equals A means is that if A exists, then A exists. The proposition itself does not assert that A exists. It only gives us the form, the shape of the proposition, and not its content. Content is what a proposition is about, telling us something about A, if A indeed exists. Whatever the first principle is, it must be a principle that is posited in and by the I. To posit is to be aware or conscious of whatever it is that is posited. The first principle is posited by the I. This first principle is about something, an A, and hence this A must be posited in the I. To understand this, imagine that there is no knowledge of anything yet. So what can this A possibly be? Whatever A is, A must be something that the I posits. The I is at the moment the only thing, since there is no knowledge of anything else ex hypothesi. In that case, the only principle that we can derive is I equals I, or I am I. I am identical to myself. Even simpler than that expression of identity is I am. I simply and purely exist as myself. I must exist because I am aware of my own existence. I hope you have been trying to walk along to discover alongside Fichte. It is what he recommends, that you try to undergo the same steps as he does, because it is the only way one can truly understand what he is talking about. Try putting yourself in Fichte's shoes. He is trying to figure out what the most fundamental piece of knowledge we can have is. To do that, we have to suspend whatever it is that we think that we know. It is indeed an odd and difficult thing to do, and what he arrives at is simple, though if you think about it, rather startling. And he does an even better job than Descartes. Descartes says, I think therefore I am. But what Fichte comes up with is even more brief, and in that way more fundamental. I simply am. The I posits itself purely and simply. Another restatement of the same is, the I posits itself absolutely. By absolutely, Fichte means purely and simply. Recall that Fichte is a follower of Kant. Kant tells us that all we can know is what we understand things to be. We can never know the thing in itself. What we know of anything is not the thing in itself, but only how we understand the thing to be. For instance, I see a bumblebee and think it is yellow. What I have is my subjective experience of yellowness. I have no way to know if the bee is indeed yellow to say other animals such as dogs or bats. It might be, it might not be. I simply have no way to tell since I am unable to directly perceive things in the world. We perceive things indirectly or mediately, where our perception is mediated through the structure of our understanding, which is Kant's 12 categories, space and time, though Fichte does not presuppose these categories, but tries to discover them as he continues to expand on his foundational principles. Since we can never do away with our structure of understanding, we can never know the thing in itself. If we did manage to get rid of our structure of understanding, we would then understand nothing at all. Bertrand Russell explains this by asking us to imagine we are wearing a pair of blue spectacles that are permanently stuck to our faces. Everything appears blue because of the spectacles, and we have no way to tell what the actual color of anything is, since there is no way for us to see except through the blue spectacles, which in this metaphor is the structure of our understanding. An interesting but adjacent point to make here for those who intend to read Fichte for themselves is that in the act of positing comes the fact that is being posited. In the literature, the word for this is Tathandlung, Tat being deed or fact and Handlung being action. Germans form new words by joining existing words together, and so Fichte invents this word to express this idea of fact-act, where the act is the fact and the fact is the act. The very act of positing tells us that someone is doing the positing, this someone being the I. Just to be sure you understand this, compare this to Descartes' I think therefore I am. That also is a Tathandlung. By the act of thinking, someone must be doing the thinking. Let us move on to his second principle. It is a curious thing that there is more than one principle. In the pamphlet for his prospective students concerning the concept of the Wissenschaftslehre, Fichte argues that there is one and only one foundational principle for the Wissenschaftslehre and also for each of the specific sciences. I think one way of understanding how Fichte has not one but three foundational principles for the Wissenschaftslehre is that the next two foundational principles he is going to discover is really a derivation from the first principle of I am. I have already mentioned how propositions can have form as well as content. They usually have both, though as we have seen, A equals to A is only form, since A is meant to be a variable, an unknown which, if known, is then the content of the proposition. A equals to A is the form of the proposition I equals to I, where the I is its content. The second foundational principle is based or conditioned on the content of the first principle. The second principle is I am not the not I. How he arrives at this is also by examining A equals to A. A is a variable, a placeholder by which anything can be A, including not A or the negation of A. In that case, not A equals to not A, and if the A is the I, then not A is the not I. Since not A is the negation of A, then not I is the negation of the I, or I am not the not I. This not I is posited in opposition to the I. It is what the I is not. So from the I, which according to the first principle is all there was at the start of this reasoning process or process of positing, the I manages to posit or be aware or conscious now that there also exists something that is not itself. Yet if the I is all that is, then where does the not I reside? There seems to be a contradiction between the first and second foundational principle, and here is where Fichte makes an important move which will lead us to the third foundational principle. He calls this move of reconciling contradictions synthesis, though it is later more commonly known as the dialectical method. The phrase thesis, antithesis, synthesis is widely but mistakenly attributed to G.W.F. Hegel, but it was Fichte who used it first, while Hegel did not use those words, at least in that way. The thesis is what a first proposition is. The antithesis is a second proposition which seems to contradict the first proposition. But yet it cannot be that both propositions are true and yet in contradiction. Hence a synthesis is required to resolve the contradiction, which then gives us a third proposition. In our case, the thesis is the first foundational principle of the Wissenschaftslehre, I am. The antithesis is the second foundational principle, I am not the not I. But if the I is all that there is, then where does the not I reside? Before we look at Fichte's answer to that, I should explain why from the I am, we come to how the I is all that exists. As Kant has explained, all we can ever know is what our consciousness tells us about the world and never about the world in itself. Hence, for all effective purposes, everything that I do know is what the I must posit. Whether the world outside of what I posit really exists or does not is something that, according to Kant's transcendental idealism, I cannot possibly know, since I cannot assess this world in itself, but only my own conscious experience of it. Another preliminary remark is in order. The method of dialectics can be traced back to the ancient Greeks and is exemplified in the Platonic dialogues. More immediately, Fichte credits it to Kant, though as he does with Kant's theory, Fichte takes it one step further. Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, tells us about a series of antinomies, where he presents first a thesis, such as on the existence of free will, and then an antithesis, where he presents arguments against the thesis. However, Kant calls these antinomies because he thinks that one can argue as effectively for one position as for the opposition of that position. He thinks these antinomies are irresolvable. It is Fichte that comes up with the idea of bringing about reconciliation through a synthesis of the two opposing sides to resolve their contradiction. Back to Fichte. Since the I is all that there is, and since the not I is not the I, then what place has the not I to reside? Fichte resolves this through the third and final foundational principle of the Wissenschaftslehre. The I posits in the I a divisible not I in opposition to a divisible I. To properly understand this, let's just call one of them X and the other Y. From the point of view of X, X is all there is. From the point of view of Y, Y is all there is. For them to collectively be all that exists, to be together constituting the whole, it must mean that they each have to make some space, that is, be divisible so as to accommodate the other. Hence the I as well as the not I are divisible, such that for the I, it is divisible such that the not I can fit into the I, and likewise for the not I. This means that the I contains the I as well as the not I. However, in the first foundational principle, the I posits itself absolutely. We shall now rephrase this to say, the absolute I posits itself absolutely. This absolute I is the I that is all that exists. Yet from the third foundational principle, the I is divisible. This I of the third principle is the limited I. So there are two I's. The absolute or infinite I, which is all that exists, And then there is the limited I, which is finite. The absolute I contains both the limited I and the limited not I. The absolute I posits them both, positing them as limited. Before we move on to the theorems that Fichte will derive from these foundational principles, you may be wondering, how does the I even come up with these principles? Fichte tells us that it is through the power of imagination. From these three foundational principles, Fichte will then work out 8 theorems, the first of which belongs to what he considers to be the theoretical part of the Wissenschaftslehre, and the remaining 7 to be part of the practical part. Before we embark on the theorems, we need to keep in mind that the theorems are based on only the 3 foundational principles. While Fichte has worked out just 8 theorems in the foundations of the entire Wissenschaftslehre, and later another 3 in an essay where he expands on the foundations, entitled Outline of What is Distinctive of the Wissenschaftslehre with regard to the theoretical power, there surely must be more theorems, since Fichte will contend that the whole of philosophy should be derived from the 3 foundational principles. Now that the absolute I has posited both the limited I and the limited not I, Fichte turns to how the I and the not I affect each other. The first theorem is that the I posits itself as determined by the not I. Since the I and the not I are both limited within the I, and since the I and the not I will comprise all that exists, which is the absolute I, there must exist a boundary between the I and the not I. The limits of the not I will delineate the boundary of the I, and vice versa. In that way, the not I will determine the extent of the I. At this boundary, the activity of I will be stopped, and bumping up against this limit, it will give rise to a sensation which translates itself into a feeling felt by the I. In this case, the I is the affected and the not I the cause of that affect or feeling. Likewise for the not I, its limit is determined by the extent of the I. In that way, the I posits itself as determining the not I, which is the second theorem. These 2 theorems form a pair of thesis and antithesis, seemingly contradictory. As with the synthetic or dialectical method, this contradiction must be reconciled in a synthesis. The synthesis is that the I posits itself, in part, as determined by itself and in part, determined by the not I. This synthesis proposition expresses 2 ideas. The first being that the I is determined in part by itself and in part by the not I. Secondly, there is the idea of reciprocal determination, where both the I and the not I reciprocally determine the other. As far as the I is actively affecting the not I is passively being affected and determined by the I. Conversely, as far as the not I is actively affecting the I is passively affected and determined by the not I. We are now ready for what I think are the most important ideas in the Wissenschaftslehre. The absolute I is a consciousness whose activity is infinitely going in the outwards direction. If there is nothing to stop it, it just keeps going in the outward direction. However, because its outward activity bumps up against the boundary between the limited I and the not I, it feels restriction. Because it encounters an obstacle, there is cause for it to reflect on what is going on. If there was nothing to stop its activity, there will be no need to reflect on anything. Because it now has cause to reflect on how it has bumped up against the not I, there is a need for it to cognize the sensation giving rise to the feeling and the cause of that feeling. It cognizes that it is determined to some extent by the not I, which restricts its infinitely outward bound activity. It also cognizes that it is determining the not-I to the extent that it limits the activity of the not-I. Essentially, the existence of the not-I is required for the I to become aware of itself, to achieve self-consciousness, to realize a division between itself and the other. The striving of the I to act remains infinitely outward bound, but it is met by the opposed striving of the not-I. It is in the equilibrium between the I and the not-I that the I cognizes not just itself, but also what is not itself, that is, the world. To the extent that the I is the subject determining the not-I, it is free. If there was a time prior to the existence of the not-I, the absolute I will be infinitely free then. To the extent that the not-I determines the I is limited in its freedom, constrained by the not-I necessarily. While the freedom of the I is limited, this freedom nonetheless exists to the extent that the I determines itself. In conclusion, I must admit that I may have taken some liberties interpreting the text. Fichte goes through quite a lot of mental gymnastics in working out his theorems, and I do not always manage to follow, though I do not doubt that his reasoning is sound and consistent. He makes a lot of effort to be careful and thorough, but it will take very patient reading to try to follow closely what is going on. I admit that I do not at the moment possess the patience nor the desire to really grasp all the details, which will require me to read the text one more time at least. To sum up, even if you are Kantian transcendental idealist, who is one who accepts that all a person can know is only what is in one's mind, we can still realize what is in the world, as far as an idealist can tell at any rate. Even starting from the viewpoint of the I, it does not mean that we are egoists. We will still realize that there are other entities other than ourselves. We will sense them, and our sensations of them will give rise to feelings, some of which we approve and some of which we will disapprove of. This seemingly external world of things will affect us and limit our activities, and in that way limit our freedom. They will determine us to some extent, constraining our freedom. However, it is because of them that we develop the self-consciousness to even be aware of our own existence, and in that way also of them. This gives rise to philosophical reflection, where we take our reflections one step further to reflect on the fact that we are reflecting only because of these limitations. We are to the extent of the limitations determined, but also are the determiners of things that are both ourselves and not ourselves. What then is the absolute I? Because a person can only know his representations of the world is in him according to idealism. His mind posits his own existence and also the existence of everything else. However, remember that positing does not mean making things up. Positing means being aware or conscious of what is being posited. We are conscious of ourselves, which is equivalent to saying that the I posits itself. The absolute I is indeed I myself. Within myself, my consciousness posits the entire universe of things I am aware of. In realizing my own consciousness, I also realize that there are things other than my own consciousness. My consciousness encompasses these things. There is an aspect of me which is the whole, which contains everything. That totality, qua totality, contains also me. My mind contains the entire universe, but my mind also is just the limited mind of a human being. In my consciousness of the totality, I am also conscious that there are other beings like me, which contain within themselves also the universe. We each seemingly contain separate universes, but there can only be one universe. We are separate individuals, but yet are unified because we exist in the same universe. I've only begun spelling out some thoughts that are consequences of the Wissenschaftslehre, but I think the reader can see how Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre can be the basis for an ethics if worked out further. This is Fichte's intention. At the conclusion of the series of lectures he delivers to his patrons and friends in Zurich on the Wissenschaftslehre before his time in Jena, he gave a celebratory talk entitled Concerning Human Dignity. It is a beautiful expression of his aims and hopes for the Wissenschaftslehre. As Kant's transcendental idealism has taught, everything is within the I. Hence, it is the I that brings order to the universe and unity to the plurality of things. It is not that the planets move in an orderly way, but it is human understanding that renders order onto it. This is a view quite contrary to the scientific worldview, at least as commonly understood, where the order of the universe is already there and human beings merely discover it. For Fichte, as a Kantian idealist, we do not know how the universe actually is, though we can render order onto it in our minds. The laws of nature are not justified because they represent the way nature is, since there is no way to assess how nature in itself actually is. They are justified because we made those laws to render order to nature. As Plotinus had explained, it is the agreement of the mind with itself. As we expand our knowledge and experience, likewise this order that we render expands into the universe. The human being does not simply introduce a necessary order into things. He also endows them with an order he has freely chosen, says Fichte. Since it is us who bring order, it then means we have the responsibility for how the universe should be. He speaks of a harsh world transformed by us into a safe harbor for all living things, where we, by dint of the knowledge we endow on the world, improve the world. Likewise, our shared understanding with our fellow human beings unite us as co-workers on the great, the only possible project of the human species, where in our shared humanity, we continually progress to greater heights in our common striving for truth, united as one spirit. His tone is aspirational, though his reasoning here is undeniable. Because of the power human beings have in shaping the world, we bear the responsibility for how the world will turn out. Thank you for listening to the Philosophical Bachelor.